Hello, everybody. It's me, Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994. After sunset, we went back to his flat where I had a long, languorous soak in his bathtub, and he showered to wash off the salt and sand residues of our glorious day. Then we made love on his bed. It was the first time for him. I'd already had that single, agonizing and joyless experience of being raped on a cold, wet shingle beach one night in Aldeburgh back in Suffolk in the UK at the age of 18. It had been a fleeting, dismal procedure, too quick, painful. It had been my first time, and clumsy, to be called lovemaking. That initiation by the far older man, Julian, and trusted so-called friend of my cousin's, who is now a retired magistrate in Oxford, here, and who threatened to sue me after he read my autobiography, revealing the truth. That could hardly be counted. So I was as much a virgin as Fred was. It was a wrench for both of us to have to get up and dressed so that I could be taken back to Nora House before 11. But so it had to be. But from then on, we spent every waking moment together. Fred picked me up as soon as he'd finished work, and we usually went back to his flat for supper. Although I'd completed a cordon bleu cookery course at finishing school in Switzerland, learning haute cuisine, I still couldn't do anything as basic as even boil an egg. I didn't know how to turn a stove on. Masango, our Zulu chef, had quite understandably chased us out of the kitchen at our farm, New Forest, and all I'd ever learnt in domestic science at school was cooking for invalids. So Fred cooked. He had a simple but effective routine as a bachelor. As I step into my flat after coming home from the site, I switch the oven on and put a potato in to bake. After 40 minutes, I turn on the grill, place a couple of lamb chops and a tomato sliced in half in a pan underneath, and pour some frozen peas into a saucepan to boil for a few minutes in water I had brought to a simmer in advance, so that everything's ready all at once, he told me. It's been the most practical way I could think of to make my supper, with the minimum fuss while I enjoy a castle lager on the balcony. He'd been quite happily eating the same meal every night since the day he'd arrived in Durban, those 4 or 5 months ago. I watched these preparations with great interest, and for the first time, I learned to cook a meal other than frites amande with fresh asparagus and hollandaise sauce. Useless fare, especially as fresh asparagus was unobtainable in South Africa. Fred taught me how to make other dishes, and it was from him that I acquired my love of cooking and enjoyed pottering around in his kitchen, experimenting with fresh herbs and spices which we bought from the Indian market on Saturday mornings. We still went out now and again to eat in various restaurants in Durban, and every weekend we took drives along the coasts, both north and south, exploring new places and some of my old haunts, beaches and delightful small nature reserves in the coastal bush or among cliffs further inland. We found we preferred to spend most evenings in the flat, though, sitting on the balcony, sipping glasses of Cape Merlot. I'd gone off tassies after my camping experience, while our supper cooked, watching the sunset colouring the bay apricot pink and seeing the harbour lights coming on as if by magic. First, the tiny golden bulbs that outlined the big cranes on the dock, like the lights on a Christmas tree, to twinkle in their reflections on the water. The ruby red lights on their very tops winking on and off to warn low-flying aircraft. Then every other light blinked on gradually until the whole bay was lit up. The big lighthouse on the end of the bluff flashed on and off, its powerful lamp sending cryptic warnings to the ships that lay at outer anchor, waiting their turn to be guided safely into port by the pilot boats. We spent what remained of our evenings lying in bed talking in between making love, and I began to learn more about Fred. After being raised by a succession of nannies so unlike our gentle, patient Zulu women, and basically ignored by his parents as I had been, he'd been sent to an all-boys prep school at the age of 5. This iniquitous practice wasn't out of necessity, as it had been for parents like ours who lived out in the back country, so far away from day schools. But this was the done thing. Apparently all upper-class boys and girls went off to boarding school at that tender young age, before going on to an elite private school, oddly called a public school in England, don't know why. And there, miserable and homesick, he'd been brutally bullied as a matter of routine, as were most of the unfortunate little boys. Even on school holidays, his mother chivied him into being good at sports. One sport was riding out to hunt meets, a one-off experience he never wanted to repeat. I wasn't the most confident rider at the best of times, and this hunt meant awful people with huge bared teeth tearing over the countryside after what turned out to be a non-existent fox, jumping hedges and fences, racing over ploughed fields and thundering down precipices. I was terrified, fell off my horse at the first jump and had to walk all the way home covered in mud. Mummy was furious and told me I'd let the side down. She said she'd never take me hunting again, which was quite a relief, I can tell you, he said emphatically. He was expected to excel at games like cricket, rugby, and tennis, as well as sports like deer stalking and shooting pheasants. The only pastime I really enjoyed was fly fishing. It was nice and peaceful. He was sent on to Eton, that most famous private school, after prep school, and hated it most of the time. Because he was so shy and sensitive, he continued to be bullied, along with others of his peers. Apparently, it was an age-old ritual that older boys persecuted new arrivals, most of whom, in turn, sustained the tradition of cruelty. Fred survived by remaining in the background and applying himself to academic work and music. He'd inherited his aunt's gift and revelled in playing classical piano pieces in the music rooms, keeping out of the way of the general mainstream. He'd passed his A-levels with flying colours and had gone on to Magdalen College at Cambridge to accomplish civil engineering. On one of his summer vacations during his years at Cambridge, he and a couple of friends bought an ancient car and drove to India to visit an old Etonian, a boy they'd been at school with. They bought an old Land Rover and drove it to India, only to find that the friend was an Indian prince and lived in a palace in sumptuous surroundings there. They were given a warm welcome and lived like kings for a few weeks until it was time to return to England. They sold their Land Rover, bought tickets with the proceeds, and sailed home on a cargo boat as passengers. Fred's mother, like mine, was a terrible snob and very keen on her children mixing with the right sort of people. His older sister had come out in London and done the rounds as a debutante, attending balls. That means to be presented to the Queen, and it's been done away with, thank God. Attending balls and soirees during the season. A year later, and it was Fred's turn, he spent weeks in London going out night after night to dances, parties and balls. He was a very eligible young man, heir to a castle in Scotland, along with 9,000 acres of land, a valuable commodity, and many mothers thrust their whinnying daughters forward for him to meet and partner them on the social merry-go-round. I was hopeless at that kind of thing, and the Debs were frighteningly bold. Not many of them beautiful, some not even remotely attractive, but all of them keen. They latched on like parasites, and if I danced more than once with a girl, it was as if we'd become engaged. And shortly after arriving in South Africa at the beginning of April, Fred and Mike Hoare, who's now my son's godfather, a friend from Cambridge, had completed the Roof of Africa rally in Mike's vintage Rolls Royce, and I have photographs of that. It was nearly 11 p.m. and I was due back at Nora House. He kissed me gently on the tip of my nose, then he drew back to look at me. His warm, intelligent hazel eyes unlocked the cool green challenge in mine and dissolved my defense, that inner prickly part of me that kept me remote and just one step removed from being myself. Up until now, I'd always used that distance to protect myself, particularly after the rape. I melted and allowed myself to sink into his embrace, responding to his warmth, his touch. He was the first person to have broken through my barrier to expose my heart. He folded his arms around me and tenderly rested his chin on the top of my head. I could feel his warm breath on my hair as he sighed, "Oh, babe," a whisper of happiness. "When I first saw you, I didn't think I stood a chance. That was why I took so long to pluck up the courage to kiss you. I found you were so vivacious and untamed. I thought you were out of my league and would have lots of boyfriends," he murmured. And then he turned me around to face him, pulled me back into his embrace, and kissed me warmly, softly, and I yielded. "I love you, babe," he said quietly. "I love you too," I replied, slightly muffled as my lips moved under his. Then I leant against him and nuzzled into his neck. I could feel his jugular vein pulsing against my lips, throbbing rapidly in time to his heartbeat. And it suddenly struck me that I'd finally found what had eluded me every time I'd seen those shooting stars. The fleeting moment as that spark of meteorite shot across the night skies, and I had to make a wish. This is what my wish would be from now on, to spend the rest of my life with Fred. That's all for this week. More to come. Thank you so much for listening, and goodbye. That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.